Thank you very much for those kind words, Jerry. And I have to say, the pleasure is all mine. It's been very inspiring for us, for me and my business partner, Peter, as well, to get to know Engage Liverpool and all the activities that you do and the commitment that you have to your city. So the inspiration is certainly mutual. So thank you so much for including me today. It's an honor to be here. And I have about 30 minutes max to give a presentation. So I'll dive right in and start sharing my slides, which hopefully you can now see on screen. And if you can't, you should let me know. So today, as Jerry was saying, I have a history, you could say, in the destination marketing management organization of Copenhagen. Wonderful Copenhagen. And for the past 2 years, I left the organization 2 years ago. So I no longer speak on behalf of the organization, which I should say just to be all proper. I now represent a company called Group NAO, which I co-founded 2 years ago. And so today I'll start off talking about sort of where I come from and the whole sort of concept and how we started with localhood in Copenhagen and what that meant, why we came up with that, and sort of how we followed up on it. And then I will also sort of get in a bit of inspiration from outside of Copenhagen for the end, just to get us started on how we're thinking, but also based on some of the projects that we're working on right now in Group NAO that relate to the topic we're discussing today. So that means that we'll start with the end. And then we will actually be diving into sort of very briefly around this concept of new localism and how that also feeds into the idea and the relation between visitors and locals. And then finally, the new paradigm of tourism and how that also supports a completely new level of empowering locals in destinations and in local communities. So starting with the end, of course, as Jerry was saying, when I was working with Wonderful Copenhagen, I was the development director. I took over that position in 2015, and sort of the first task that I got was to develop the new tourism strategy for Copenhagen. And so we were working on that throughout all of 2016. We launched the strategy in early 2017. And by launching it, we declared the end of tourism as we know it. That was sort of the title, which is a very loud title when you're the official tourism organization of a capital city or of any destination, really. And the reason we needed to be loud with that was really that we sensed that there was a lot of talk about everything that was changing or something was coming. And what we really wanted to say was, no, in fact, winter is already here and we need to start working in a different way with tourism. We need to start thinking about it completely differently than we have before. Now, part of that difference was really relating to this idea of the sort of a new perspective, you could say, on the tourist, on the visitor. So there had been sort of a tendency to look at the tourist or the tourists as a special, unique kind of species, almost as if they were all the same. And sort of with the strategy, what we intuitively wanted to say is that tourists are really all kinds of people. They are you and me. And so in the meeting with tourists, it's also just a meeting between people with multiple different interests and motivations, reasons for coming, and desires and how they want to explore. Now, another part of that is also that increasingly with digital means, with travel experience as well, but especially with digital means, with our smartphones in our pockets, constantly connected to everywhere and everyone, the visitors were no longer dependent in the same way on sort of the official version of a destination. They were independent, you could say, of the touristic version of a place, and they had access to all kinds of inspiration and information also based on the interests that they came with. So that also sort of increased the demand for what we've now known, or not what we now talk about as sort of the local experience or the authentic experience. And that, of course, means also that increasingly tourists were sort of getting closer to actual local people and to local lives. And so that was kind of the core around the idea of localhood and how we framed that. So the vision of the strategy is really called localhood for everyone. Now, localhood was actually a word that we made up, and well, none of us are native English speakers, so we tried to test it on native English speakers as well, because we wanted it to be quite intuitive. But if you read the strategy document, you'll also note that there is no sort of actual definition of what it means. And that's also because we wanted it to be something that everyone sort of co-creatively defined. And it's an individual experience in many ways. And it also depends on where you're at, where you're from, what your values and what your commitment to it is. But the idea of localhood is really sort of that sense of Copenhagen that you have, that Copenhagen is somewhere and not just anywhere, and that it is for everyone, visitors and locals alike. Now, as part of that, what we also did was that we kind of reframed how we talked about it, because we felt that talking also always about visitors and tourists were creating a distance between us. And so in localhood for everyone, we wanted to say, well, you're welcome to come here and be a local for a while. So we framed it instead as temporary locals, and then people living here on a permanent basis were, of course, permanent locals. So this was in many ways sort of the idea of the strategy that came out. And also we were starting to talk about the importance of what we framed at that time as people-based growth. So the idea of really seeking that balance in how we develop tourism. Now today, and it's not that long ago, it was early 2017, but today this feels like topics we've been discussing quite a lot over the past couple of years. But at that time, it was actually quite new that we started talking about our local residents as stakeholders, as influencers, as important in the conversation of how we develop tourism to Copenhagen. And they were also sort of a key part of how we developed the strategy at the time, both in terms of surveys, but also in focus groups and ideation workshops and so on and so on. And at that time, that was quite new for us to work in that way. Now, the strategy came out, as I said, early 2017, and that actually kind of followed, following that was another summer of increasing discussions around over-tourism and increasing media reports about problems of over-tourism and tourism negatively impacting local lives across most of European capitals, and also increasingly in Copenhagen. And so while this was not necessarily a topic we had discussed a lot throughout the localhood strategy, the strategy itself kind of became part of that conversation quite quickly. And localhood as well was also defined as a concept or a response to over-tourism, though initially that wasn't actually the idea of it. And so the criticism against localhood was also this sort of notion that it was commodifying the being local. It was commodifying the experience of local in a way that perhaps did not respond to what local residents actually wanted. And to that, we were always in a conversation around saying it's not actually, the vision is not localhood, the vision is for everyone. And so the actual vision was a balance of that. So following the strategy, and while I was still in wonderful Copenhagen, we launched another project called 10x Copenhagen. Now, initially, a lot of the reactions around that were, you know, do you want to have 10 times as much tourism to Copenhagen? But the idea of it was actually really sort of the innovation concept of Google, where we said we don't want to improve by 10%. We want to take things apart, really understand what Copenhagen is about, what tourism and what the tourists and the interaction between visitors and locals is like, and how they each use the city, what is their behavior, what is their meeting like, and how can we work to make that better? How can we actually work to make tourism a relevant force for good for our local residents? So we did a heck of a lot of research, and you can see some of the data points up here. It was the biggest research project we had carried out in wonderful Copenhagen at the time. And we got an immense amount of insights and knowledge out of it. And if you're curious, you can go to 10xcopenhagen.com. The research is still available, and it's also updated sometimes with new reports and insights from the great research team of wonderful Copenhagen. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of the key results. So part of that was really sort of diving a little bit into how do visitors and how do locals use the city differently or not differently. And what's interesting is here now you see all the neighborhoods here of Copenhagen in Danish. But if you note sort of the darkest blue area, which is the inner city, so the historical inner city where we typically have quite a lot of visitors, and also where locals tend to sort of reference it as a very touristic part of the city. But what's interesting is that when we asked visitors where they go, you can see 87% of them say they visit the inner city while they're in Copenhagen. But if you look at where the locals go, they actually also, 72% of them say that I go to the inner city in my free time. So what we're starting to observe is really that sort of the concentration of people within the inner city was not just a touristic thing, it was actually also in the meeting between locals and visitors. Now, there's a huge support among locals to increasing dispersal, so getting visitors out into the neighborhoods. But that support is not necessarily reflected in a desire to have them to your neighborhood. So only 38% think that their neighborhood has capacity to take more visitors, which means 62% don't think so. So, that really showed us that there is something to work with here, and also to understand you can't just talk about over-tourism at a city level. We really needed to get closer to understand at exactly what hyperlocal level do we see that the tensions in the meeting are not going very well, and where do we see that it's actually going quite well. Now, part of that was also understanding what is the perception of tourism in the minds of our locals in Copenhagen. And there was a very strong perception between sort of tourism, you could say, that adds value, and tourism that the locals do not find add value. And so you could almost split that into two groups, where one is sort of the monofunctional, the ones that look very touristy, that do very touristy, what the locals would often refer to as mass tourism, the ones that come in buses. Which, you could describe them as monofunctional. So they seek out the functions that are specifically for tourists. Whereas the locals instead had more value or more sort of valuable perception of the individual travelers that seek off the beaten track, that act more and that immerse themselves into local culture and spend time to get to understand that. So the ones that actually also use many of the for example, means of transportations that locals do. So, in that, of course, in Copenhagen includes biking, which Copenhageners think is really sort of the right way to experience Copenhagen. They have a lot of respect for visitors who do it, except they don't want them to bike in front of them when they're going to work or when they're picking up their kids, because to us, of course, it's a highway. That's how we transport ourselves around our city in our everyday lives, whereas visitors, of course, are in experience mode. And so there were a little bit of that sort of contradiction, and we want them to do it, but just not in front of me. And so you could say that sort of one of the key findings is really this idea of not developing so much for the monofunctional or the mono tourist, but really engaging more with the multi-use tourist or the multifunctional tourist who immerses him or herself into local community, into local society, and seeks out has a curiosity to understand and get deeper. Now, the final result I want to show you from 10x Copenhagen before we move on a little bit is this part, because we do actually, from the results in the research, we could see that there was quite a big support to tourism from Copenhageners. But when we asked them about tourism impact on their quality of life, the answer is a little bit different. So 25% feel that tourism has a positive impact on their quality of life. Now, this is, of course, before COVID. These results were launched in 2019. So I think the report, the data is collected throughout 2018, if I remember correctly. But the real sort of key number here is actually that 52% of local Copenhageners are neutral. So they don't really feel anything about tourism in terms of their quality of life. And this is a very important number because in many ways, the long-term viability of destinations depend on tourism improving the quality of local lives. I will dive into that a little bit more, but so this was really sort of the deep knowledge that Copenhagen developed to understand how to start working with tourism development in the future, and has implemented multiple projects across those results later on. Then I actually left the organization, and so I've been independent since 2019 or summer of 2019, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift a little bit perspective, and we can go back to Copenhagen as well in the discussion afterwards. But I want to share a little bit with you based on some of these results, where I also see this going in terms of both the relation between visitors and locals, but also the new paradigm of tourism. So first off, a little bit about that new localism that we see. So localhood and localism has often been connected in discussions. Now, part of that has been sort of the local experience, which is much more as an observer, someone who stands outside. Now, throughout the pandemic, but also before the pandemic, we've seen a shift in that towards more of a local immersion. So it's really about visitors taking the time to immerse themselves into local communities, to get that understanding of local culture, and even seek out the positive meetings, you could say, with local communities. So this one is an example from Copenhagen, the Absalon Community Center, which is really a place where you can go and have communal dinners every evening. And it's one of the most popular places to go also as a tourist, but actually also as a local in that area, where you know you'll get to meet new people and engage with new people. Now, I think that has also shifted a little bit towards not just being an experience, a shared experience of place where you meet temporary and permanent locals, but also a different kind of localism, where it's really about what you leave behind as well as a visitor, that you leave something behind that you contribute to, actively contribute to local quality of life. And so, of course, many of you will be familiar with the campaign from Faroe Islands called Closed for Maintenance, where they close the islands down for 3 days and invite 100 volunteers of what they call voluntourism, to engage with local in different kind of maintenance projects, building pathways and painting schools and so on. Now, this kind of idea of contribution or voluntourism is really starting to take on as part of how we as visitors also need to engage with local community. And actually just now Hawaii launched a new program called Malama, which means Take Care of Hawaii. And it's also based on voluntourism. So it's 100 stakeholders in Hawaii who are engaged in this program. And basically as a visitor, you can do one of the designated volunteer activities designated by the hotel or the restaurant that you're seeking out. And through that, you can get, for example, 1 night for free at the hotel, but it's also engaging you into different kinds of volunteering projects. Another example of that, and which I'm sure some of you are also familiar with, from Big Town in Scotland, where they have, I think it's 1,000 residents and 10 bookshops. So they have a very strong DNA and identity around being the book town of Scotland. Now, one of those bookshops, you can actually book as an accommodation the top floor and stay there as a visitor. But while there, you can also run the bookshop in the same building, and you can do what you want with it. You can have events, you can do whatever. But what's interesting about it is that the locals in the area know that visitors are coming and taking over this bookshop as part of their stay. So they go in and they seek them out, and they, they engage actively with this, which I think is a core example of how this could work, and how you can also actively work to improve not just sort of the meeting between, but also the idea of locals as tourism as relevant, as contributory to their local quality of life on an experiential level. Now, interestingly, and this has been accelerated definitely throughout the pandemic, but this whole idea of visitor and locals converging. We were playing around with it a little bit in Copenhagen with this strategy when we were talking about permanent and temporary locals. But we see this sort of engagement or convergence much more now, also now that we can work from anywhere, and lots of people are still working remotely, have companies that have introduced more flexible working sort of structures. And so a lot of destinations are tapping into that. And I love this example from the Norwegian island of Træna, who's had campaigns throughout a couple of years on Try an Island. And it's basically residencies for chefs and artists, but also for families, and quite recently also for bureaucrats. And the idea is really sort of a convergence between tourism, but also attracting people to stay within that small island community and contributing to it for longer periods of time. So you can choose to come as a temporary visitor or a temporary local, but they also want you to stay longer if you fall in love with the place and with the community. And I think this is something that we see in more places, not necessarily as directly as in Træna, but also this whole idea of us not selling ourselves as destinations in the eyes of the visitor, or dependent on the demands of our visitors, but really starting from the values of the community that we represent. So Helsinki had a huge campaign about a year ago around freedom really as a core value of Helsinki community, based on local residents and their stories around freedom and what it means to them. And part of the campaign is really inviting people to share that value with the local community of Helsinki. And we see the same now in Amsterdam with their sort of recovery strategy, where they're reclaiming sort of the narrative of Amsterdam from having had years of discussions around over-tourism and really not doing any marketing at all. What they're doing now is they're reclaiming the narrative. They're talking about valuable visitors as those visitors that share their values. and that add value to Amsterdam throughout their visit. So this is really sort of a shift in how we define and how we narrate our destination that is based in our local community rather than based in the demand from our visitors. So this is really sort of the new paradigm of tourism in many ways, that it's starting from ourselves and not from what we can attract or what we can appeal to or what we can be to visitors that come from the outside. The idea is really, it's not about what locals can do for tourism, it's what tourism can do for locals. It's not tourism as a goal in itself, it's tourism as a means to build stronger and better and more resilient communities and really improve the quality of life of local communities. So we've seen this also throughout the pandemic. We've seen an increase in sort of conversations, because if we start from local community, of course, you can't define it in a closed room as a tourism organization. We were trying to do that in Copenhagen as well with the 10x Copenhagen project. It was not us in a closed room of researchers trying to define what Copenhagen was all about. We were out focus groups interviewing to understand what is the core identity, the core values of this community. Because when we work in tourism, basically we're selling places where people live. And so we were trying to be respectful and mindful of that. And this is something that you see in much more places now. So these are just examples from the past months. And with Bordeaux and in France, they've had huge campaigns and huge conversations around the future of tourism with local communities. This is, of course, not something entirely new. We've seen resident sentiment surveys for quite a few years, but I think what's changing really about that is from initially monitoring or measuring whether whether locals approved or liked tourism. Now it's changing really to, what does it mean to you? Does it make you more happy? As we can see from Thomson Okanagan in Canada, where they're measuring the well-being, they're measuring the happiness of their local residents and how tourism is part of contributing to that. So it's basically just shifting the perspective from from inside tourism, you could say, to inside community. And you can see those conversations and those institutions happening in much more structured ways now as well. In Barcelona, they have the City Tourism Council, which is an institution of representatives of local community, but also from academia and from a lot of the industry as well, to discuss, where do we want tourism to go in our city? How do we want it to develop? How can we make it contribute in new ways and to a more balanced way of life in our city? And so part of that in Barcelona is actually that 50% of the tourism tax revenue, the Tourism Council gets to, or recommends how to spend that, how to reinvest that into local community. Amsterdam's recovery plan is the same. They're building community funds to be reinvested into local community, local businesses with tax revenue. And in Austin, Texas, 15% of the accommodation tax actually goes back to the local music industry, which is of course core DNA for a city like Austin, Texas. And finally, you have a tax like the sustainable tourism tax in the Balearic Islands, or in Hawaii, where they're right now considering introducing a visitor impact fee, namely to address the fact that visitors are having such an impact on local lives. So how can we make sure that we reinvest part of that revenue back into the local community? And so you could say that the new paradigm about tourism is really that it shouldn't be a closed conversation that happens within sort of a tourism professional community. It should happen in communities like this, like the one we're in today. And so there's a shift along this. This is sort of the spectrum of public participation, from simply informing and consulting to involving, collaborating, and finally also to empowering locals. So it's not just about checking in, it's actually about empowering a shared decision or sharing power around how we develop tourism to our communities. And to really explore that, we've actually just launched a new project, which we call Time for Democracy. And what it does is it explores, how do we actually do this in a meaningful way? How do we have meaningful conversations with local residents, between tourism professionals and local residents, between destination management organizations and local communities, on how should we develop tourism moving forward? And we have 18 destination partners with us in this project, and we're very excited to have Marketing Liverpool as well as a partner in this project to really explore, how do we actually, what are the tools and methodologies of engaging in that conversation in better ways? And so also as part of that, what should be the new sort of measurements and objectives of tourism development moving forward? And so just to summarize, some of the key shifts that I see happening here is, so we're going a little bit from talking about, and the criticism that we saw about localhood as primarily focused on local experience and also being primarily customer centric is something you can come from the outside. It's something we offer to you as an authentic experience, to really being more about how can you as a visitor contribute to the local community, and starting within that community. It's a community centric approach rather than from a customer perspective. It's shifting from tourism as a value in itself to really being about the values of community and how tourism can add value to that. And it's not just from a marketing perspective of standing out or differentiating yourself, but it's really about standing up for something or standing for something. What is your community all about? Freedom, as we saw in Helsinki. And it's shifting a little bit just from measuring the sentiment of locals to actually empowering locals to take part, to have a conversation around the future of tourism to their destinations, to their communities. And it's also not just about the input, but actually what is the outcome of that? It's not just a conversation, but it's how do we then act upon it? What do we do to make change in tourism moving forward? And so that was starting with Copenhagen and a little bit of what I see happening also now, and this exciting new project that we've launched around democracy, which I hope to be able to discuss with you much more in the coming months. So thank you so much for the time and I will stop sharing my slides and look forward to hear questions and further discussion.